inviting me here. Unlike Kriti's very generous words, I am no expert on Sabarimala. I have thought a great deal about it, like all of you. But I'm delighted to see such interest in this question, and it is really the spirit of JNU that we have all cherished for so long, and I look forward to your comments and no doubt your questions after I say a few things that have occurred to me in the course of the last few weeks. I would like to say at the outset that I'll move away from the political cacophony. I'll come back to the question of the political towards the end of what I have to say. But since I have about half an hour, let me start with a few other questions by asking, first of all, what is at stake in Sabarimala? So, the place, the controversies that have been generated have begun, as you know, with the legal question, which is the most important question that has arisen vis-a-vis the Supreme Court judgment, in which 4 judges favored overturning the tradition which disallows women of menstruating age, that is between the ages of 10 and 50, to worship at Sabarimala. And there was, as you know, in this judgment, the sole dissenting opinion offered by a woman judge. Let me just outline at the outset that Anju Malhotra was making an argument that the suit was not maintainable because the parties demanding the change, that is to say the Young Lawyers Collective, were not themselves believers. So this is one of the arguments that she put forth in her dissenting judgment. Some of you may know that her dissenting judgment has been hailed by other scholars of jurisprudence as much as it has been critiqued by other kinds of scholars. But to just summarize very quickly, she starts off by saying that the suit is not maintainable since the parties demanding the change are not themselves believers, and that constitutional morality cannot prevail over beliefs and practices of a sub-religious group, which are, these are matters that are internal to religion. In other words, she is suggesting that dissent within religion has to be in some ways sorted out by the adherents themselves without the intervention of something like state law. So, of course, we can begin by asking this question about how does one deal with dissent within religions, and what is the space of the law in this. Malhotra herself is saying that courts cannot deal with the question of religion unless, and she makes a very interesting qualification here, it is pernicious, it is a pernicious practice, and she gives the example of sati. She says that would be the kind of pernicious religious practice which calls for the intervention of the law. So it's interesting that she gave this example, and I'll come back to it a little later. Now, there are 2 problems with the parallel that she gives of, for example, the pernicious practice of sati. Because we now know, especially after 40 years of feminist historical scholarship, that the organization of opposition to the practice of sati, beginning from the late 18th century, taking force in the early decades of the 19th century, very rarely that form of cultural nationalism which ended in the abolition of sati in 1829, very rarely took the actual feelings and beliefs of women on board. It was a debate which was largely conducted by and between men, whether they were missionaries, whether they were colonial administrators, or whether they were Indian cultural nationalists. We all know this. especially from the seminal work of people like Lata Mani. So it was a transformation which was enabled in part because of the kind of embarrassment about Indian religion that was engendered by colonial officials. But more important than that history is this, the assumption by Judge Malhotra that religion and society are somehow two watertight silos, or airtight silos if you like. That, you know, there is a sphere of the religious which is somehow separate and distinct, uncontaminated by the kinds of hierarchies, discriminations of which our social life is marked, by which our social life is marked. They are not two watertight or airtight silos. And this is in fact exactly what Justice Chandrachud suggested in his judgment, citing Allari Krishnaswamy, and he says, that is to say, Allari Krishnaswamy said that there is no religious question that is not also a social question. If we look at it that way, then of course the practice speaks of discrimination against women. It is of course once more asserting, and this is important for us to understand, that women can only be the bearers and not the makers of cultural identity. They must everywhere be marked, but not be themselves the makers of cultural identity. And therefore it is difficult to disentangle, I would say, the social from the religious in this instance. Chandrachud actually focuses on this, Justice Chandrachud, when he says that there were two kinds of struggle which led to the writing and establishment of the Indian Constitution. One, of course, is the one we are more familiar with, the political struggle which wanted to end in granting equal rights to all citizens in the Indian nation. But the other, he says, one which was equally important was the social struggle waged by people like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar for social and not just political equality. So in some ways he is asserting that the Constitution as a document is actually envisioning not just political equality but also social equality, and therefore has an opportunity to intervene in this sphere of something which seems to suggest that there are categories of purity and pollution that are operating to keep women away during a certain period of their lifetimes from worship at this important religious site. Just today, the Hindu has carried an article by a former census commissioner, S. Jaishankar, who invokes, interestingly enough, the fundamental rights of Ayyappa himself as being somehow violated by the Supreme Court judgment. And no doubt this kind of argument will also gather force in the days to come. What Chandrachud is saying, just to close that part of the argument, is that these questions are inseparable. That is to say, there is no doubt. In other words, he is suggesting that something similar to caste discrimination is being practiced in the disallowance of women to this sacred site. Now, I should just mention here that we are today at a moment when we have been witnessing very successful legal challenges to certain kinds of sacred practices. Shani Changnapur is one, Haji Ali is another. These are recently won victories by women for the right to worship at very different kinds of religious sites. Let me start by saying that this invocation of right is not against faith. In fact, the appeal is being made to law in order to enable faith. So let's get this straight. You know, I'm saying this because for a very long time, and particularly in the early decades of the feminist scholarship, I would say in the 70s and 80s, perhaps even in the early 1990s, there was skepticism about the role of religion in our social life by Indian feminists. That skepticism gave way, I would say, in the early 1990s to a healthier respect for the kinds of solace that religion offers to women in countries like India. It was occasioned in part, the second thought, as it were, was occasioned in part by the demolition of the Babri Masjid, by the fact that there were large numbers of women who had been mobilized by the BJP at least 2 or 3 years previously, particularly during Shilanyas, to actually establish and build a new Ram temple. And these were women who acted out of what they believed was their faith. So we shouldn't have this kind of, impression that everything was machinations of the Hindu right, but rather there was something that was driving women to participate in this movement in ways that feminist scholarship needed to make sense of. I'm talking about people like Tonika Sarkar, Urvashi. I think what happened at that moment was this recognition that faith, and religious faith in particular, is not fatally patriarchal. And it is in that spirit, I think, that we should understand the demand that is being made today for the entry of women to a variety of spaces that have hitherto been forbidden to women. I'm also saying this because I was last week at Guwahati at a young scholars conference, and there was a large number of young people from all over the country present there, almost 100 young scholars. And when I finished speaking, although I was not necessarily speaking about Sabarimala, one young woman came up to me very agitated and said to me, if this place of worship does not want women to be there, why are women so keen on going there? Why don't they leave religion alone? Why is it that they want to participate in a religion which is clearly expressing such discriminatory processes? And it is a question that needs to be answered. So I'm saying to you that I think today we are at a position where we have a healthier respect for questions of faith and for understanding that faith need not be fatally patriarchal, and that those who have demanded a right to enter these places are within their rights as people who are faithful themselves to want to participate in worship. Now, let's just go to the kinds of objections that have been raised since the judgment to what has actually happened. First of all, there has been this argument that this is tradition. As I said to you, today's paper cites this person called Jaishankar, who is described as a very important historian, who says this has nothing to do with gender discrimination, but it has everything to do with tradition. But here I think we should stop and say to ourselves, remind ourselves, first of all, that especially vis-a-vis the Ayyappa temple, and this is what I had written one newspaper article about, these are traditions which appear to have been invented, and there is no tradition which is lost in the mists of time, like we would like to imagine that. And all of us are scholars here, we are all aware of the argument about invention of traditions. There is practically no aspect of the Sabarimala pilgrimage which is in some ways pure or true to some earlier ancient belief. Practically everything has changed, and I would say it has changed very dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly as very, very large numbers of people from the 4 southern states, but also now increasingly from places like Orissa and Bengal, are beginning to frequent the place. I looked up the figures for those who attend the Magaravalaka and Mandalavalaka, which is the season which begins very shortly there from November to January, and the estimates vary from something like 2 crores to 5 crores. Now this is not a small number. I could not verify this number, incidentally, I should mention at the outset. But even if it is the lower end, even if it is 2 crores, it is a very large number of people who are going to Sabarimala today in this period. It means many arrangements have been made, the road has been paved, the steps have been covered with panchaloha, which is this alloy of many metals, including gold, therefore making it impossible for the practice, which is perhaps a little older, of breaking the coconut in front of the Lord. And there is also various other kinds of restrictions that are being practiced in order to enable this very, very large number of pilgrims to visit the site. So there is not much. I don't want to repeat myself because this is something I've already said in that article, but let it just be said also that one of the major ways in which changes have been made to the practice, because the insistence has been that women cannot perform the 41-day vrata because they are themselves likely to have their periods in that period of 41 days, is that that period itself has been abbreviated in many cases, where the mala is worn maybe just 5 days to a week prior to actually going to the temple by men. So all kinds of adjustments have been made in order to accommodate this very, very large number of male pilgrims. That's all I want to say, and we can have the rest in discussion if necessary. So there is nothing which resembles perhaps some kind of pure practice which predates the last 20 or 30 years. Secondly, the question that has been raised is that this is a matter of faith and it should therefore be understood and settled as a question of faith between those who are believers. But then the question we might ask is, whose faith are we discussing? Because it seems to almost suggest that any woman who wishes to go and worship at this temple is herself faithless. It cannot be that she has any faith. This clearly is unacceptable, because this is precisely what the court judgment was about. Who are the ones who are aspiring to worship this God? Can, as Justice Chandrachud very importantly pointed out, can the protection of Lord Ayyappa's celibacy be a burden on women alone? What is it that is so precious about his celibacy that needs to be protected by the women alone? In other words, let's be a little bit more generous. And I want to say here that I think all the transformations that have happened in the pilgrimage have been tolerated by Lord Ayyappa without any loss of faith on the part of those who actually visit this place. The second argument that comes out is that social reform must come from within. It cannot be brought from outside by courts and so on and so forth. And of course, one of the great ways in which the court judgment has been trumped is to say, look at the large numbers of women who are opposed to any change in the practice. And you are all aware that the BJP, in particular the RSS and other groups who are active in that region, have been very, very careful to position the women opponents in all the media and in the photographs and so on and so forth, in order to say, it is not just men who are opposing any change in this practice, but it is women themselves. And we need to answer this question, because I think we need to also say, and here again I would like to point to feminist scholarship, which has shown over and over again that, of course, women are complicit with patriarchy in many instances. Patriarchy is not pure domination. It's also resting on the consent of very large numbers of women. We know this from all the compromises with which we are faced on a daily basis in our own lives. But let me just give you a completely different example, because we were hard pressed in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, when the anti-dowry murder campaigns were at their height, to explain why it was that mothers-in-law were some of the worst perpetrators of violence within these homes. Of course, they had something to gain from the violence that they perpetrated on young daughters-in-law. That need not today surprise us so much. It is something we need to understand in the very nature of patriarchal power, that it functions with the complicity of some sections of women. So that is in some ways to be answered that way, that women are the biggest supporters of the status quo. I would not say they're the biggest supporters. They certainly have been made to look like the most visible supporters, but supporters they are in some cases, and we have to accept that and understand it rather than trying to take the easy way out and rather lazy way out of saying, it is women themselves who are their worst enemies. Thirdly, and I think this is an important thing that has also come out, particularly in the long interview with Devendra Fadnavis just a couple of days ago, in which he was specifically asked why, if he had supported the entry of women into Shanishangnapur and Haji Ali, today the BJP is saying that it is an internal matter and the law cannot intervene. And his answer was that social reform is of necessity a slow and gradual process. He is not saying that the demand of the women is wrong. He is not saying that at all, but he is introducing a new element in which he is saying it has to happen with the consent of all those concerned, and that therefore it cannot be an overnight change as it has been introduced by a Supreme Court judgment. It is something that requires the work of getting permission. And in some ways this is an interesting response, because it is not actually saying that, it's not talking about faith or even blind faith as it were, but rather opening the door to something that allows for internal social reform. Now, forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about internal social reform. Since the 1980s, ever since the Uniform Civil Code debate has been challenged, in particular by forces on the Hindu right, insisting that there should be a Uniform Civil Code, if only as a way of punishing the Muslim population of this country. Feminists have been hard-pressed to find alternative ways of thinking about gender-just laws. And one of the arguments that came up even within the feminist movement was that gender justice must come from reform within communities. Well, 40 years later, we are still waiting for that kind of internal reform. Certainly it has not revealed itself so clearly. Many of the interventions, in fact, have come from state law, and we don't know of too many examples of this gradual change coming from within the community itself. Fourthly, there has been another kind of interesting argument. This has been put forward, for example, by people like Rahul Ishwar, who is insistent every time that he comes on television to say that there are temples where women are the principal devotees and men are not allowed, and he of course gives various examples. This is just another variant, as it were, of Hinduism, that there is this variant of Hinduism which does not allow women. Equally, a number of temples which don't allow men. Let me say here that it is very striking that what we are witnessing, particularly since the early part of this millennium, is a new kind of masculinization and corporatization of places of worship where female devotees were in power. And I'm not talking about large, well-known temple complexes like Ayyappa and so on and so forth, but much smaller ones. Around Hampi, for example, in Karnataka, I came across at least 2 such instances of women devotees actually being replaced by young male devotees, to the extent of elbowing out the women out of their rightful place, the role they played, and so on and so forth. So devotees' power has been chopped down, but also female priestly power has been chopped down, as has been documented by Bhanmati Kalluri in her discussion of the Pajinis of the cones in Andhra Pradesh. I just cite these two examples, but there are any number of these instances of this very kind of new, I would say, new masculinization that appears to be even taking over those locations where women had once enjoyed some kind of religious power. Okay, so I have just 10 minutes left to me, and I would like to quickly pass through to the question of what social reform histories have been in India, to signal to you that the question of reforming certain kinds of social practices, particularly in the 19th century, and we all know this from our school history textbooks, you don't have to be a history major or even any kind of specialist in history to know that there were entangled histories of social and political change throughout the colonial period. However, the women's question was somehow always considered as something that was part of a social reform agenda, a cultural nationalist agenda, a question that is interior to societies and therefore not requiring the kind of political interventions that anti-colonial opposition called for. It is interesting that and this is shown to us by scholars like Mrinalini Sinha, that it was only in 1930 that the social and the political actually attempted to come together in the demand for the transformations in the Child Marriage Act. But it was due to the threat posed by Dalits' demand for separate electorates that women were asked to sort of withhold their political ambitions, and once more one went back into this split between the social and the political. But today, after more than a century of legal intervention in the social, to say that religion is above the law is to ignore all those who have actually benefited from the appeal to law. It also is ignoring a century in which the agentiality of women for change, both for change and against change, as we have seen just a moment ago, has been asserted. So, in the case of, so what is at stake? That's what I began by asking, and let me conclude by saying what I think is at stake in this particular instance. One of the issues that is at the heart of this matter is, of course, the practice of the pilgrimage to Sabarimala, which is a sphere of homosociality which is very jealously guarded. The anthropologists Caroline and Filippo Osella have actually studied the Sabarimala pilgrimage. Many have, but I will just cite their work. They've studied it in some detail, and they have shown what an important part of this pilgrimage is the homosociality that it engenders. The kind of male bonding, the kind of assertion of a male privilege, and anybody who has witnessed the trains full of Ayyappas going towards Kerala in the season will know what I am referring to. Now, it is not necessarily the same kind of virulent masculinity that is on display during the Kavadiya processions in northern India, but there is certainly the outlines or the first signs, I would say, of the assertion of an angry Hindu masculinity as it has been nurtured in the Indo-Gangetic region for more than a century, now spreading in the same virulent form to other parts of India. This is not to say that there was no hypermasculinity in Kerala, not at all. In fact, there are very excellent studies today about the nature of the hypermasculinity in the region, and it is an interesting point to remark, and I hope my colleague will say a bit more about it, that there is a very marked regional hypermasculinity which has resisted re-socialization, even by, the long tradition of Marxism in this region. This has been pointed out by a variety of scholars, not necessarily feminist scholars, but especially feminist scholars. So I would say that what we are witnessing is actually a warning to women. A warning to women to remember their place. And Sabarimala as a sign to suggest that women should remember their place. And this is happening, I would say, out of a certain degree of panic almost. Because there are too many signs today that the individuation of women in India has happened at a much faster pace than the individuation of men. What is interesting about this homogenizing that is happening at one level? So at one level it seems like there is a certain kind of homogenizing of this hypermasculinity. On the other, the interesting point about the Sabarimala case, which we need to keep in mind, is that for the first time maybe, to my knowledge at least, Hindutva is actually making a case not for homogeneity but for exceptionality. That is to say, here is a case of a particular regional practice which needs to be protected. It should not be brought under the sweep of what we know as national Hinduism and so on. It should be protected precisely for the features that it displays as a local regional practice. I am suggesting this is not an accidental kind of warning that is being issued to women. It is not accidental, for example, that the Akhil Bharatiya Sant Samiti just yesterday has called for the protection of not just the nation but of Hindu Sanskriti by protecting Behan and Beti. So, women, once more, must be and continue to be the bearers of this cultural tradition. They must bear the burden of this tradition without any transformation or change, without any question. And they must not therefore be open to the winds of change. Kerala is one of the locations which has seen a very long period of high educational levels attained by women, high organizational levels attained by women both at work and, for example, it is one of the earliest locations to have a sex workers union. If I can give an example, an autobiography by Nalini Jamila, which is a sex workers autobiography, a Kiss of Love movement which happened, the defiance of an entrenched film actors union, etc. We are seeing many signs that that women in Kerala are not willing necessarily to take it as it is being delivered to them anymore. At the same time, we should not neglect the fact that it is one of the most hypermasculinized regions of India, and at this juncture what we are witnessing is something of a backlash. So let me just end by reminding you about something. The BJ, and I'm coming back to the political, which I said I would perhaps not get sidetracked by at the beginning of this brief talk. In 2016, Bhayaji Doshi had said that entry of women into temples, particularly Sabarimala, should be allowed even if it is a 1,000-year tradition. Okay? So here is Bhayaji Joshi himself, who is today at the head of the demand that no tolerance will be shown for Supreme Court judgment intervening in such practices, was somebody who said to the Akhil Bharatiya Pratinidhi Sabha in Nagaur in 2016 that women should be allowed into temples and places of worship regardless of the antiquity of that tradition. What has made them change their minds? It's not just him, it's also an RSS functionary, Parameshwaran, who said, of the Sabarimala Vichar, who said that there is no reason to ban women in Sabarimala. What has changed? We need to ask what has changed in the last few months that has led to such a serious revision of a position that they had very firmly taken. Is this a dress rehearsal for the Ram temple, where once more we are being told that faith is above all adjudication of the law? Or is it simply, or not simply, but importantly, a backlash against the demand that women are making to be allowed to express their faith by being allowed into a space like the Sabarimala temple? It seems like this fear of menstruation, by the way, I should just mention also in passing, is this very, very primal fear. Those of you who are students of anthropology will know that the fear of menstruation is something which is marked in many societies, and we are no exception, because it is bleeding without being wounded, and there is an element of mystique about it. It is not an affliction, it is not an illness, and yet it is something that is a part of your life cycle, something which has challenged, as it were, those who actually fear feminine power. And let's also be clear about one more thing, and that is that we have, so this is the other thing that I forgot to mention, which is constantly thrown in our faces. We have, in India, we are told, a large number of female goddesses, that is, who are worshipped, and therefore it cannot but be that women are held in very high religion. But let us remember that both the worship and the degradation are fashioned by patriarchies. This is something that we need to understand most importantly. Even if you take the Bhagavati worship in Kerala itself, it is dominated by men. There is no feminine principle that is at work amongst the devotees of Bhagavati, who is one of the most important goddesses in Kerala, very bloodthirsty, but nevertheless someone whose malefic power is invoked largely by men. Let me conclude this therefore by saying why the turn to the Constitution. Because we need a new political language, we need to imagine a new social, and it is very clear that feminism has not found, at least to my knowledge, any kind of tradition or myth or received practice which is, which is empowering to women, in spite of the large number of goddesses that we have. Because our myths are full of ways in which women have been maimed, women have been petrified, women have been mutilated, women have been set on fire, and so on and so forth. So it is really the Constitution that is the visionary document. It is imagining a future which is quite different from anything that we have known. And therefore, the appeal to the Supreme Court, and therefore, however small that number is, women who have fought for the entry to Sabarimala are indeed not only fighting to assert their faith and to express their belief, but also for a new kind of society. Thank you.